The information found in this podcast is not a substitute for help from a licensed mental health professional. Hi, and welcome to the Women in Depth podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lourdes Viado. Join me as we explore the inner lives of women, their struggles, fears, hopes, and dreams. We'll go beneath the surface and take a deeper look at what is hidden, unknown, uncertain, and uncomfortable. Hi, and welcome back to Women in Depth. Today, I'm really excited about our guest who has been a previous guest on the podcast, and this is Julie Bjelland. And Julie Bjelland is a licensed psychotherapist and author of several books, including Brain Training for the Highly Sensitive Person, Techniques to Reduce Anxiety and Overwhelming Emotions. When Julie was on the podcast before, she spoke about the gifts and challenges of the highly sensitive person, and there was a lot of positive feedback to this episode. And so I wanted to have Julie back on to continue the conversation and to actually explore a specific aspect of the trait of high sensitivity, which is high sensitivity in children. Now, in addition to her private practice, Julie also developed and teaches innovative online global HSP brain training courses. She's a consultant and supervisor to other therapists. She teaches workshops and she coaches HSPs globally. Julie's passion and expertise is in neuroscience and determining how to successfully train the brain so people can live their best lives and thrive. Her most recent book has received outstanding reviews from world-renowned psychologists Dr. Tara Brach, Dr. Rick Hanson, and Dr. Ted Zuff. Julie specializes in working with anxiety and the highly sensitive person, couples communication, self-esteem, and the LGBTQQ community. Hello, Julie, and welcome back.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to do this with you again.
Oh, I am so excited. I have to say that I have a very personal investment in today's topic because we're going to be talking about high sensitivity in children. So thank you.
Yes, this is a good topic, being that we were both highly sensitive children.
Right.
and we both have highly sensitive children.
Exactly. and you would think that being highly sensitive yourself, that it might be easier to parent a highly sensitive child, but I feel like sometimes it's not.
Yeah. Yeah, it can kind of have its challenges and it's also its benefits. So it's got both sides.
So for listeners who may be joining us for the first time, haven't listened to previous episodes on high sensitivity, or really don't know anything about it, but have heard a few things here and there, let's start with some basics. Can you share, Julie, what is this trait of high sensitivity?
Yes, it's an innate trait, and it's found in about 15 to 20% of the population. You're even finding it in animals, actually, too.
Wow, really?
Yes.
I had no idea.
It's
amazing.
It's a really interesting trait. Elaine Aron, who's kind of the pioneer for really discovering the trait and the first one to really be talking about it a lot years ago, came up with an acronym that describes all highly sensitive people. It's also called sensory processing sensitivity. And that, to note, that's different than sensory processing disorder. It's not a disorder, it's a trait. And, just like eye color is a trait. So the DOES acronym stands for: D is for depth of processing, O is for overstimulation, E is for emotional responsiveness and empathy, and S is for kind of an awareness of subtle stimuli. There's a lot of positives and there's some challenges with the trait as well. I focus a lot on helping people learn to thrive. And it's going to be really interesting to talk today about children, highly sensitive children. And because we have research that shows us that if we're doing the right kind of parenting for a highly sensitive child, those children actually thrive and excel more than what we refer to as a non-HSP. So HSP for so it's
Wow.
really a valuable discussion. And I know there's a lot of parents out there that would want to know more about it and make sure that they're kind of doing all the right things. Because if we do the right things, our children are going to thrive. If children are being raised in environments that aren't so healthy and meeting their needs, then there's more potential to see anxiety and depression.
That's very interesting about the research that you just mentioned, that when highly sensitive children are supported in the way that they need to be, that they actually thrive more than
Yes.
non-HSPs. Wow. So I'm wondering, and I know you can't, this is research, so you can't just kind of extrapolate all over the place, but it just makes me wonder if that's the case, then if highly sensitive children's needs are not supported when they're growing up, does that affect them also proportionally negatively more? Does that
Yes,
make
it
sense?
does. And that's what the research is showing. There's something that's actually called validated differential susceptibility. That's kind of a long word, but if
It is.
anybody wants to look that up, those words, it's basically that HSPs benefit more from a better childhood and they're harmed more by a poorer childhood.
No pressure there.
Well, hopefully today we'll get some good tips on what to do and what not to do.
So, Julie, I wanted to go back to something you said. You said that there's a difference between the trait of high sensitivity and then a sensory processing disorder. And I'm so glad you brought that up because, I've had people ask about that.
Right. Yeah. And probably best of all would be I would direct people to read. Elaine Aron has something on her website that describes the differences in depth. And I can have some links to that on my HSP resources page. But there are similarities in terms of some of the sensory experiences. But the disorder part of it is the difference. And also kind of the origination of why it's happening in the brain is different. But it's interesting, like I can remember watching a YouTube video about the experience of, say, somebody with a child with sensory processing disorder. And it was like everything seemed really loud and chaotic in the world. And I was like, yep, that pretty much is like what it's like to be HSP. So there are some similarities to it, but big differences as well. And I think that would probably be best is to kind of direct them to that because
Okay.
she's got a lot of good information about those particular differences. We do see misdiagnosis as well in, for example, ADHD is another one that sometimes gets misdiagnosed. It's just so important for parents to be really informed about this trait and to make sure that whoever's working with your children is also informed about the trait. And I just can't stress
So,
that enough.
so are you saying, I just make sure I understood you correctly, Julie, that the trait of high sensitivity in children can be misdiagnosed as ADHD?
Yes. Well, there
Okay.
can be children who are also highly sensitive and have ADHD. We are actually seeing a lot of misdiagnosis, though, where some highly sensitive children are actually not ADHD, but they're getting diagnosed with that. So I've seen all kinds of things. I work with a lot of parents of highly sensitive children, and I've seen situations where if maybe their child psychiatrist is not familiar with a trait, they're going directly to medicating the children, and then they're having issues with side effects and sensitivity to medication, because that's another thing. As a sensitive system, we tend to, both adults and children tend to be more sensitive to medications and have more side effects in general. So it is something before you have your children start with any kind of medication. I would really advise that they get very clear about the trait, do their research, make sure that their medical professional team is familiar with it so that they could differentiate the two.
And Julie, you talked about the DOES acronym, and I was wondering if you could go through that again and maybe share how that might show up in a highly sensitive child.
Yes, definitely. The D for the depth of processing. Highly sensitive children they process information very deeply, which means that they need time to reflect before deciding. So they might be the children that take their time to decide about entering into a group or making a change, doing one thing that's different from another thing that they've been used to doing. There's time. I could think of an example, like a client of mine was talking about their child who, it was like they wanted to take them to do something fun for the weekend, but they were feeling like their child kept on sort of having a problem with it. One of the things that we did was work on giving the child more time to process what they're going to actually be going and doing. And that's something that even with my own children, I remember when we would go do something that was new, and if they had some resistance about it, what really worked well was talking them through it, maybe even visiting the place before you go, making sure that they have the time to process, because we tend to process things so much. I've said before, like in my previous podcast, we talked about for a non-sensitive person might be having like 3 tubes of information going into the brain, and a sensitive person has 50 to 100 tubes of information. So it's an incredible amount, and it makes that child tend to be very conscientious, and we want to get things done right the first time so that they can have high expectations of themselves, and they want to get it done right, and that tends to be part of the trait. It can be challenging sometimes as a parent. I can remember when one of my sons was little, it would take him like a half an hour to put on his sock.
Oh my gosh.
He wanted to do it exactly the right way. This is when he was really little and just learning. And he didn't want me to do it for him. So I had to sort of allow time for something like that. So that's kind of the depth of processing kind of shows up in things like that. I consider that to be a real positive, though, the kind of the conscientious, aware part.
This could also, explain why, at least with my son, sometimes being spontaneous or changing gears, change of plans. We're doing this instead of this. It seems to sometimes not go over very well, or it just takes him like a longer time to warm up to things.
Absolutely. And that is exactly why part of the depth of processing. And it shows up different in different children. I have 2 highly sensitive children. One of them could adjust more easily to changes, and the other one, it was a big issue. And I learned about, I sort of had to enter his world. So if he's down playing with Legos or something, and I need him to go brush his teeth, for example, I can't just say, go brush your teeth right now. I have to kind of enter his world. Otherwise, there's going to be sort of a tantrum. Or even as an example of if you're changing plans, like you're supposed to go to the park that day and you can't now, or you're supposed to go home, but now you have to stop somewhere. There are some children who are very sensitive to those kinds of changes, and it's almost like there's like an explosion going off in their head, where it's like they're thinking about 1,000 different things. Some parents can get very frustrated by that, but I think if you understand what's happening to them, you can allow those extra few minutes to sit down with them, kind of answer their questions, make sure that they're clear about what they're doing, and it becomes part of your routine if you have a child like that. And it's much easier to do that than deal with the meltdown.
So is it almost just like, our computers, when there's too much load on our computers, it slows the computer down. And we look at that as a negative, but when understanding that the highly sensitive trait, there's just so much stimulation and so much going on that it
Oh,
operates better.
absolutely. I often compare it to, I call our brains supercomputer brains. And it's like constant download of information. And if there's too much of too much happening at once, then there's going to be a freeze, just like a computer freezes. And that's when you can see it can show up in different forms. You could see it in children. You could see it in a burst of anger, a meltdown. You can see it in, they're going in the corner, they're hiding, the fight flight system kind of being activated. So yeah, that's definitely part of that. And and that's another reason why highly sensitive children often need they need a lot of downtime. That's an absolute necessity, and you will see that show up too if they're being too overstimulated, and then you're kind of expecting them to go directly to sleep after an overstimulating day, for example.
Okay. I'm guilty. I'm laughing because I'm guilty.
Yeah, and it's hard. So just like with adults, sensitive children need that downtime, and kind of a slow movement into the end of the day will allow them to process the day. And you might end up processing that with them. For example, something happened at school that day that
Yeah.
affected them that they need to go to process with you.
This is so interesting because one of the things I've found with my son, I thought it was a negative that he's just dragging things out. But I've found over the years that a longer bedtime process works better for him. Like, some parents might be able to say, okay, we're in the tub at 6:30 and your pajamas by 7, lights out 7:30. What I've found, that was my plan when I first began it. And now what actually works best is telling him about half an hour, 15 minutes before that we're going upstairs to take a bath. Because I found if I tell him any sooner, it's harder for him to make that change. And then it's like you ease into the bath and then you ease into the story time. And then it's like a very long bedtime process, but it works for him. And when I tried to do it like within an hour, he would be stressed, I'd be stressed. And what would end up happening often is he would just be upset and it would be 9:00. So it would take the time anyway if I didn't. Yeah. So now it was just, okay, let's just ease into this. We'll just go slowly. And that way lights out by 8:15, 8:30. But yeah, that's so interesting. It reminds me like back in the day, remember that there would be like a volume dial that you could ease up by increments.
I use that as an analogy a lot. The dial of our nervous system, turning up and turning down. And yeah, exactly. You're right. It's an adjustment for many parents to slow down like that. But it's probably good for the parents too, to slow down a little bit. Even mornings, that comes up a lot in my work and research is slower mornings. And prepping the night before, that maybe the clothes are laid out, the backpack's ready to go, everything's kind of laid out ahead of time. Definitely giving them that space. And each child is different, but if you're noticing, if you have a child that's really having a hard time with those transitions, from playing to the bath or going to brush teeth or getting in bed, to give that time for transition and to be consistent. If you're really consistent, you do it the same every night, that can be very grounding for a highly sensitive child because they know what to expect.
It's almost as if like with highly sensitive children, just because everything is, like the next letter in the acronym is the O, the overstimulating. It all like relates to it. The depth of processing, which is why it's so overstimulating. And then why you also need to slow things down.
Absolutely.
Like it all
That's
just
really
interrelates.
The reason for the overstimulation. And it's the overstimulation is the kind of the most challenging one. We can be more stressed by noise and chaos, and there's that need for downtime and time, quiet spaces. And sometimes there's parents that have their children they're in school all day and then they're doing after school activities and they're not getting home until late. And these can be really big challenges for a highly sensitive child. So it's something to keep in mind if you're really seeing some negatives with your child and they're having a hard time. That's something to look at. It's one of the first things I start to look at with a parent that comes to see me is, what is their schedule looking like? What's their sleep looking like? I know like the National Sleep Foundation has recommendations of what's enough sleep. What they say, like they say preschoolers like 3 to 5 is maybe 10 to 13 hours of sleep. Well, the 13 would be the minimum probably for a highly sensitive child. A school-age child, maybe 6 to 13 years old, maybe 9 to 11 hours. Again, the 11 is, we're looking at the higher amounts. Teenagers, maybe 14 to 17 might need 8 to 10 hours. And again, they're going to need the higher amount. And that is so essential to get enough sleep is a big part of the well-being of a highly sensitive child and adult.
So the next letter, the emotional responsiveness and empathy, how have you seen this show up with the children or the families that you've worked with?
They're so in tune with what's going on in in around them and around, they can read their parents. A lot of parents think that if they're having conflict, maybe they've somehow hid it from their highly sensitive child, but most of the time they can feel the energy of the room, and they know what's going on. That empathy is incredible. Emotional responsiveness we're definitely seeing, that that children can be very affected by distressing experiences at school, or throughout their day, whatever's going on for them. Everything is kind of magnified in a way. Both positive and negative experiences can be magnified for highly sensitive children, and you'll see strong emotional reactions. There's a lot that can be done to help children with this part. So if you're having a child that hasn't had enough sleep, they're overstimulated, you're going to see an increase, and a big increase in the meltdowns and distressing experiences. But if you're helping your child to live as balanced, as centered as they can, then that's going to get better. They're going to manage those extremes a little bit better, and like you said, with that volume that is not going to be turned up as high. One of the things that's important for highly sensitive children is to feel validated with their emotion. So if we're growing up with a parent that's like, oh my gosh, what's wrong with you? Why have you been so sensitive? That's going to be very invalidating, and it's going to make them feel a lot worse. And I used an example in my book about the difference between like a 5-pound, an emotion weighs about 5 pounds, but the judgment about the emotion weighs about 1,000 pounds. So what you can do for your child is to find out, to inquire about what's going on, and why are they having this extreme emotional reaction to something. Find out what's going on in their world and help them develop. So parents can be part of helping their children to develop tools to manage those extreme feelings. And that can be a very rewarding experience. And that's part of the positive parenting of a highly sensitive child, is to do that. I can remember one time my son was young, and my other son had like locked him out of the patio door, and he was like kicking the door to get in. And they were playing around, but he wasn't happy to be locked out. And so he got really upset and was kicking the door. And I was concerned about that for lots of reasons. And so the first response with a parent might be to get upset about that, but that's not going to work for a highly sensitive child. We need to get them in a position that is soothing, because as soon as a child is upset about something and they've kind of activated that emotional limbic system part of their brain, they're not going to be able to hear anything you're saying. They're not going to be able to take it in. So if we want to teach them, so in that example, I helped soothe him. So he had already learned some tools about, like, he actually did better going into his room and having quiet time, whereas my other son did better like taking a walk or something like that as part of soothing. So after he calmed down, we talked about the situation. We talked about what could be done, what could have been done differently. And he came up with the idea, if that happens again, maybe I'll turn my back so I'm not looking at my brother. And then I won't be as upset or something like that. And I thought, okay, well, that works. And he came up with that, So this is an example of that we help them with some of that emotional regulation. And if parents are doing that, then these are the kids that are not going to be struggling with depression and anxiety when they get older. And now, as my kids are teenagers, they're 14 and 16 now, I just get amazed at their ability for emotional regulation. It was not something I was able to do at their age. So I'm always just so amazed to watch them thrive like that.
Well, how amazing is that they've grown into emotionally skilled young men, and that's thanks to you, Julie. You set that up for
Yeah,
them.
it feels good to see them like that, and I'm always feeling impressed by that. And it's just an example of what we see in the research says the same thing, that the kids with the right kind of support, they really thrive, and they become quite independent, and they learn emotional regulation when we teach them about self-care and downtime and things like that. And that's why it's so important to teach them their the skills that they need for, self-soothing. I think it's really important for all highly sensitive people and children to learn self-soothing techniques, self-compassion techniques, things like that can be, even techniques that are good for instant relief. For example, if they're really distressed, to teach them a deep breathing skill where we take in, that's a great one to go to instantly, where they're in the middle of being upset and you can teach them this. But I actually think it's good to teach the children all of these methods when they're calm, when you're just kind of hanging out and you're
Right.
teaching them some of these methods. And then when it's actually happening, they would have already learned it. So they'll know what you're talking about. So it's like, remember that breathing technique? Let's do that. You take that deep breath in, we count to a count of 4. We hold it for 2 seconds. And then we exhale so slowly that we're counting all the way to 7. And we're going to do that like 5 times. So you make it kind of fun, and it's a skill that is fantastic about slowing the heart rate if they get really upset about something. And that's an instant help because it kind of sends a signal to the brain that they're okay. So I like to teach them that. I also like to teach kind of the self-compassion. There's like a 3-step self-compassion technique that I like to teach too.
Can you talk about that really quickly?
Yeah.
What those are?
I learned that from Kristen Neff, who I really recommend checking out her work, because her whole work has been about self-compassion. So they've actually done brain scans to find out what parts of the brain get activated when you use this technique, and they found it, and it's so helpful. I just can't stress this enough for teaching us how to kind of nurture and have compassion for ourselves. So it starts out, the first step is that you acknowledge the suffering. So if your child is scared or hurt or something, you're acknowledging that. As soon as we start acknowledging something out loud, the brain starts to process that and change it so it's almost like building a bridge from emotional brain to cognitive brain, to thinking brain.
I
So
like that.
you acknowledge it, and by the acknowledgement of it, you're already dropping the impact by about 50%. So there's already going to be some calming happening. Then the second step is sort of a universal validation. Makes sense that you're feeling that way. Other people probably would feel that way too. So you're understanding that it's normalized. The third step involves both physical, it's like a warm, physical, soothing touch. And I like the one where you put your hand on your chest, and there's proprioceptors there that can be very calming for us. So some people like to put their hand on their chest. Some people like to give us like a self hug. Both of those kind of experience the same thing. And then a warm, soothing, like, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. What do you need right now? Teaching them to do those 3 steps will light up that center of the brain that is calming. So it's sort of an instant. It's just, we've seen that, like if, our children fall and hurt their knee or something, and they're crying and they're so upset. And then we go do those things, right? We soothe them, we hold them, we make them feel safe and comforted, and then they start to feel better, even if they're still hurting. So we know that these methods work, and we can teach to do it to ourselves too.
That's powerful. And you can just see how that would work. It it makes so much sense. And they are really actually very simple things that can really affect significant change and healing.
Oh yes, you're right. It's very significant. It's amazing, and it was something that I had to learn myself because I didn't have that technique. And it's a skill building, so it's something that you get better at with more practice. It's just like if I'm trying to, make my biceps stronger, if I just lift weights once in a while, they're not going to be that strong. But if I do it often, they're going to be stronger. And so it's fascinating to have that kind of a technique available to you, because no matter what, whether you're physically or emotionally hurt, it's something that you can have with you at any moment. That can be very helpful. There's also like tapping techniques that can be helpful for children, and for all highly sensitive people, it has to do with you tap different parts of your body, and there's there's a lot of information about that online too. But it has to do with the communication too of the two parts of the emotional and thinking brain being able to communicate with each other better.
So creating that bridge again, just like with the 3 steps of compassion.
Yes.
Could you share maybe a couple of those tapping techniques, or what areas seem to work well with children?
Yeah, well, there's different ones that you can use. There's one where, so the idea is that when you're tapping, you can, if you pick certain parts of for example, there's some on your face. And what's interesting is when we think about, sometimes when we're distressed, think about what you do often naturally. Sometimes you start rubbing around your eyes, for example. Start rubbing those parts. A lot of people tell me that when I teach them these techniques, they're like, "Oh, I kind of do that already." So you can do it with actually a rubbing or tapping. And with the tapping, it's alternated. So if you tap around starting around your eyebrows, and you go all the way around your eyes, you're tapping alternately with the left and right all the way around. There's different points of it too. There's one kind of under the nose, under the mouth. One I also like is this one isn't tapping, but it's about rubbing your hands, and you can do that. Like if you're nervous about if you have an older child that's like taking tests or something, they can do this right under their desk and nobody's going to even know it. It's about massaging from the base of your fingers all the way to the tips. And these are techniques that can be helpful. You can even do, we talk about counting techniques. You're counting 2, 4, 6, 8. That again, activating cognitive brain. As soon as cognitive brain is activated, it's a support to the emotional brain. And when I talk about like limbic system, emotional brain, when that's activated, that flight fight system that gets activated often for highly sensitive people, the thinking and cognitive brain basically goes to sleep. And that's why we have trouble accessing memory and facts, and everything just seems worst case scenario when you're in that space.
Right.
So anything that you can do to bridge over to that cognitive part is something that's going to be really helpful.
Like to bring it back online.
Absolutely.
So it's almost as if, as you're describing these different techniques, to me, they remind me of the technique that is commonly used for anxiety, which is grounding,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, these are forms in a way of grounding. It's grounding you to the concrete world, or again, bringing you from your emotional brain to your more rational brain. And also why, like you said, you can't really teach these things when someone's in the throes of a
Yes.
emotional meltdown, because like you said, you can't even remember, what you should do next, or think clearly, that you can't really learn anything at this time either.
Yes, absolutely. And I like teaching highly sensitive individuals to get to know their body sensations. And you can do that with children too. So, for example, if they're already noticing that their heart is racing, maybe they're upset about something, then their brain has already sent a signal to release adrenaline. And now they're going to be in that fight flight situation. But there's almost always an experience in your body that you can feel before that happens. And teaching children to know what that feels like is so fantastic, because maybe it's a lot of people talk about it as a tightening, like a tension. They start to feel some kind of a tension in their body. And if you can teach them about those sensations, and one way to do that is talking through it. Like if they've had a meltdown, for example, and they're calm, you sort of rewind the tape and talk through it and see if they can identify what was happening to them before it really got escalated. And then they can get to know, like, oh, I'm getting that feeling in my body. This is when I'm supposed to do XYZ, which would be the self-care.
Wow, this is so helpful, Julie. I'm just so excited.
Oh,
I'm going to go try all of these things.
good.
So I wanted to switch gears a little bit. And before we switch gears, I wanted to bring something up that I think some parents and teachers and others mention, which is they'll say, you're just describing all children. All children are, move slowly. They don't do well with transitions. They're emotional because, their prefrontal cortex isn't well developed. And so I just was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
I don't actually think that all children are like that. And I think what we're going to see more in highly sensitive children is you're going to see more extremes in general.
Okay.
But again, it also depends on the parenting. If you've already been a parent that's been really supportive, you're really sensitive to your child's needs, you might have a highly sensitive child that doesn't have a lot of issues if you're already doing some of these things. So it kind of depends on their environments, their home environment, their school environments. But you will notice with highly sensitive children that they are very observant. And that's if we go to the S of the DOES acronym, sensitive,
Right, right.
or they're more aware of subtle stimuli, for example. Highly sensitive brains have the ability to detect the most subtle, say, facial body expressions, for example, that up to 85% of the population cannot detect.
Oh my gosh, that is so true. Sometimes I will feel something, or I know I made an expression. I'm not even looking at my son. I have my back to him. He's doing something else. And I'll intentionally do that. Like maybe I'll be frustrated or something's going on because I know he has this incredible antenna,
Yes.
you know, and he will say, Mom, what's wrong?
Yes.
And I'm just going, how did he do that? You
Oh,
know?
absolutely. That is they feel everything. I mean, they have the ability to, I can remember even myself in school, for example, I was so aware of like, how is the teacher? They don't seem like they're doing very good today. Or I was like, oh, there's somebody over there arguing, and I'd be so affected by everything that was going on, which you can see is equivalent to what they might say is, you know, ADHD, for example, or ADD. So
Right.
that's something that can look similar, but it doesn't mean that your child is. It can seem that they're more distracted. But yeah, they'll pick up on everything, and that's why they're oftentimes too slower to interact and slower to warm up with people. And people sometimes they'll say, "Oh, they're shy." It isn't equivalent to being shy. Shy is more of kind of a learned behavior, but it doesn't have to do with the trait. And unfortunately, we'll see that in class. Maybe you bring your child into a preschool or kindergarten or something, and they'll see that the child's kind of holding back a bit, and the teacher's saying, "Oh, are you shy?" So instantly, there's this sort of negative label attached to being that way. And I think it's so important to understand that you need to give
Right.
that
Yeah.
kind of. They need to be able to observe before entering, and to allow that space for that and not make them feel that there's something wrong with that. And that's hard in our society because our society values extroversion. And while 30% of highly sensitive
Right.
children can be extroverts, 70% are introverts. So we're going to see a lot of that where the sort of slow to warm up, and there's nothing wrong with that. We sort of have to allow that. And that might be something to talk to the teachers about, anybody that interacts with your child. I think it's important to not label these as negative. And I think many of us had a lifetime of negative labeling that then affects our self-esteem. We're so kind of pushed into kind of what we are. There's the expectations of what we think, you know the expectations of what we think children are supposed to be like. And that I would also fell into that when my boys were young. And one of my sons having this, I would see other children just like they could just go up to anybody and start talking to him. And I would be like, oh, is there something wrong with, I'm thinking in my head, is there something wrong with him that he can't do that? Is there something wrong with me as a parent? That's, we often go into that as
Right.
parents of what have we done wrong? And now I watch him just, he can
Right.
talk to anybody he needs to talk to. And so I always tell highly sensitive parents that, it gets better. All the worries that you're having, it gets better. And also just if you understand these pieces, because I have a lot of parents that think that their children are this way because they're trying to do something that's manipulative or to get out of something, or there's some kind of a negative thought about where that child is coming from. But almost always highly sensitive children, they really want to do the right thing. They want to make you happy. They don't want to make mistakes. I really have not encountered a manipulative, highly sensitive child. Most of the time that something's going on for them, there's reasons behind it. Some of the positives of the trait, for example, are that they're incredibly conscientious, have a high level of awareness. Often you'll see that they also use pretty big words for their age, and they can have a lot of depth. and when they're talking about things. They're very kind and compassionate. They care so much for others. They learn very quickly. That's another thing that's really great too, is that when you approach your experience with a highly sensitive child in more of like an educational way. So I talk about, like, if you go into thinking about discipline for children, highly sensitive children do not do well with authoritarian discipline. They're already hard enough on themselves about things. Then if they're given the right amount of information and you're clear with them about what you need from them, and you have a very clear set of expectations and you've talked about it with them, they will do really well in those environments. That's something very significant. That's a really important when raising a highly sensitive child.
I think a lot of this is going to be the things that you set up prior to it, just like we talked about. You can't teach something when they're upset. But what are some suggestions you have for, I guess, discipline, consequences? How do you, when you need to, discipline a highly sensitive child?
Well, it'll be different based on each child's age, but in general, once they start getting a little bit older where they can kind of follow direction, like, they can follow a couple of directions. I need you to go upstairs and go over here and do this. If they can follow something like that, then you can start talking to them about your expectations about things. Like, for example, I have one son that's great about doing chores, and the other one is a bit of a procrastinator. And so sometimes he'll start to slip a little bit on the expectations that we have as a family. And we talk about chores as being something that, it helps the family. So if they're unloading the dishwasher, that's something that helps the family. And we talk about it from a positive perspective, that we all do something as part of this family. So if it's not getting done in the way I need it to get done, or in the way we've made it clear, then I would actually sit down and we'll have a talk about it. What's making sure that, if I say to my highly sensitive child, this is really important to me that we do it like this, for example, and leave some space for, like, if they have a challenge with the way what I'm saying, like it's not possible that for some reason, we might have a discussion about it. It's really amazing how intelligent highly sensitive children are. They can have discussions at pretty young ages, and if they know that they know what you're expecting, then it's going to be a lot easier. Now, if you feel like you've set up the expectations, they're very clear about it, you've had kind of some family meetings, everybody's on the same page with it, and it's still not happening, the first thing I would do would have a discussion. Why not? Let's figure out what's the block to getting this done, what's happening. If you are in the rare case of they've purposefully not done something, or they've maybe done something very dangerous or something, you could have some of the techniques that I like are more about, I might, for example, if they have a phone or a computer that's important to them, then they might have some restrictions with that. Maybe they don't get to watch TV. Or you also don't want to do really long consequences. Like, I wouldn't take it away for a month, for example. It might just be a day or a few days, depending on what it is. But I can't stress enough about how much they thrive in having conversations. You can sit down together and talk about, okay, if you don't think this is fair, let's have a discussion about it, and do brainstorming together so that they're also a part of it, and making sure that everyone that's taking care of your child is on the same page. Because if you have one parent letting them get away with stuff and another one's really strict about stuff, that's not going to be clear for the child. So it starts with that the parents are on the same page and that the expectations are clear. They also do better with positive reinforcement. I can remember one of my sons being very picky about mealtime for a while, and I've actually seen that a lot when I work with parents of highly sensitive children. For whatever reason, it could be a sensory issue or other, but we did a reward system that for example, if he could get through one meal without complaining, he would get a ticket. And once you got a certain number of
I love
tickets,
it.
it was already established ahead of time what that meant. So we'd pick out a reward system, whether it's like you get to, have a special outing with your mom, or you get to, something that's important to them. I wouldn't turn it into like giving them, sugar treats
Right.
or money or something like that, but doing it more about like something that's important to them that would be fun and a reward, and having that set up ahead of time. We would actually keep that piece of paper up on the wall, what that meant. Also, what can be good for young children is to make lists of what your expectations are. So when my children were young, I actually had, and that was something that we created together, a checklist, so that, when they, for example, at night, these were the things that we have to remember to do. That helps a lot too, because if they're very young, it can be hard for them to remember all the things if you have a lot of things on the list. Brushing teeth, flossing, getting their
Yeah.
clothes together, things like that. If you're really struggling a lot with highly sensitive children too, is to think about if they're overstimulated. That could be part of it. And I know that they're both Elaine Aron, and in the anxiety and phobia workbook, there's a recommendation for like off time. Well, they're talking about adults, but I think it's important for children too. And I'll tell what it is for adults, and it can be similar for children. But they talk about having 1 to 2 hours of downtime a day. So I think Elaine Aron actually puts that a little higher, but maybe perhaps two. So that's 2 hours and downtime a day means that there's no expectations. You're not doing chores or homework or the to-do list, but you get to do what you want. Read, play, have time that's quiet, and then have a full day off every week too. So that means not overscheduling the kids where every Saturday and Sunday are completely full days, as well as full days at school, for example.
That makes so much sense. I know for me, when I've overscheduled myself, when I try to get something done, I can't. Like I just space out. My brain won't let me. It's my brain is saying, you know what, Lourdes, I'm taking 1 or 2 hours right now. You
Exactly.
can try
You just get
all you want to
foggy,
go through
and
that
yeah,
to-do
you
list.
just
It's not
can't do it.
happening.
Absolutely. And that's when you'll see a lot of tantrums and
Yeah.
meltdowns, and
Yeah.
it's like going back to the supercomputer brain. It needs time for both processing. So I always like to separate these. It needs time for processing, and it needs time for rest, and it needs time for restoration. So I actually talk about all three of them separately so that we understand it isn't being lazy to lay around. And it's like pretty much not such a thing as a lazy HSP, in my opinion. Even if we're doing nothing, we're doing something.
How right. So can you differentiate between those last two, the rest and restoration?
Yeah, rest I would consider to be where you're starting to, that volume of your nervous system is starting to slow down. From thinking about like if we're flooring the gas pedal of a car engine all day long, it's going to get burnt out. So the rest part would be slowing down that motor. I consider the restoration to be about filling up our tanks, our energy tanks. So, for example, if we know that there's going to be a very busy week ahead, there's some extra things coming up, I think it's very helpful for the highly sensitive being to be able to save up for those. And that might mean that we do extra things, we do extra self-care, downtime, things that are positive to us. We generally do really well, like spending time in nature and things like that, letting more downtime and playtime be, so that kind of, you can imagine that there's tanks inside of us and there's an energy tank. And if we enter into a busy week with a full tank, we're going to probably do pretty well. If we enter into a busy week with an empty, depleted tank, we're going to be in trouble. So that's how I separate it.
Julie, this is so helpful. I know that this episode is really going to be helpful for parents, teachers, therapists, anyone who is highly sensitive themselves, whether, even if you're an adult, because all of this applies to you as well. And I just want to thank you again for sharing your wisdom and these practical things that, people can start doing immediately to impact the experience their child is having their own experience. I mean, you can make these changes, right after listening to this podcast. Yeah, I love that, because it's important to me that, while we get the insights, that there's also a practical piece to it. And
Oh,
I just
thank
love how
you.
you meld those two together so beautifully. Julie, what is the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you and, if they want to learn more about your work, and also share any of the offerings that you have that listeners might want to participate in?
Okay, sure. Well, my website, which you'll probably have listed, is just juliebjelland.com. And I have lots of resources on there. I have an HSP resources page, even that's just everything HSP and everything that helps HSP. And on there, you'll find different parts of, I do a lot. I'm pretty active on my HSP Facebook group, for example. Just started some other social media recently. And I've started to do some videos on YouTube. And I always love to hear from people, like if there's something that they really want to learn or understand. Sometimes I'll just make a video about it. That's something I've just started recently as well. And I have a couple courses that I'm offering for highly sensitive people that are helpful for, they're right now they're created for the highly sensitive person themselves. But if you're a highly sensitive person and you have highly sensitive children, this is something that is also going to help you because you can learn those same tools. And then my book, the brain training book, it has so many great methods in it I've come to develop over the years of working with highly sensitive people. So that's something that's accessible to everybody.
And I just want to add to that, if for the listeners who really enjoyed this episode, please check out episode 63. That was when Julie was first on the podcast, and she spoke about gifts and challenges of the highly sensitive person. And also check out episode 53. And this is when April Snow came onto the podcast, and she talked about understanding the highly sensitive person. And April Snow also has a community for highly sensitive therapists. She's in San Francisco and does a lot of work around this area as well.
Thank you for what you're doing, and you make this experience wonderful, and I'm proud to share it out in the world. I always talk about how soothing your voice is. Wonderful. And it's always fun to talk with you and talk about my favorite subject.
This is one of mine also. So I'm just this has just really been a fun experience for me, and I learned so much. I apply it to myself. I apply it to my clients, to my son. So thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the next time you're on the podcast. We'll be sharing all the links that we mentioned with listeners. Again, thank you so much, Julie.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the Women in Depth podcast. I hope it brings you a deeper understanding of yourself and others, and that you found some insights that illuminated and inspired. You can follow Women in Depth on Facebook and YouTube, and if you haven't yet, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review. And finally, if you enjoy Women in Depth, please share with a friend. Again, thank you so much for listening, and see you next time.